Joining me now for more on this is Professor Tim Lindsey, the Malcolm Smith Chair of Asian Law at University of Melbourne. Thanks very much for your time. I guess just the reasons for the laws, because it's described Indonesia as the world's third largest democracy. So a democracy, is this the will of the people? Is that a fair representation of these new laws?
No, I don't think it's the will of the people. I think it's the will of the politicians in the national legislature. I think you have to bear in mind that Indonesia is heading into a major election of the national legislature and of the president in early 2024. And that seems a long way off. It's quite close politically in Indonesian terms. And I think what we're seeing here is legislators and members of the executive preparing themselves, positioning themselves ahead of that election and the campaigning that will dominate a lot of next year by presenting themselves as moral champions, as people who can get this long-awaited new code through after decades and decades of failed attempts to pass it. That doesn't mean that it is popular in Indonesia. It's highly controversial. And one of the reasons why it's been delayed so long has been that every time they've tried to pass it in decades since the 1960s, it's led to public protests. In 2019, we saw the biggest public protests in Indonesia since the fall of Suharto over this precise issue.
So is there a chance that people power pushes back, that this won't actually be enacted, do you think?
Oh, it has been enacted. It has been passed, but the government said that it would phase in introduction over 3 years. I don't quite know what that means, but given that it's a law that's in place, but I think they're trying to give themselves some wriggle room. Some provisions may be delayed, some may end up being amended in the interim, but I think we're going to see protests, and I think we're going to see challenges in the National Constitutional Court.
So, given what you've said there about what you think the overall will of the people is, do you have any fear that that we're seeing the world's biggest Islamic nation essentially go down some sort of fundamentalist path?
No, I don't think this is really about some sort of takeover by Islamists. Islamic parties are quite small in Indonesia. They haven't been electorally successful. Indonesia has a population of over 90% who are Muslims, but they don't necessarily vote for Islamist parties. I think there's been research that's shown that many of the so-called Islamizing laws that have been passed in Indonesia have actually been passed by non-Islamist parties, by nationalist parties who are trying to increase their electoral attractiveness. They're playing a religious card in a lead up to elections, and I think this is also about that. It explains why the government was so keen to rush this through this time on quite short notice.
And the usual assurance is offered in circumstances around Indonesian laws around, well, tourists should be fine. As has been pointed out, this doesn't exclude tourists in terms of a law. How that plays out, I mean, could we see maybe religious groups, people that really want this sort of thing to apply, going to Bali, reporting tourists, trying to make it a reality? How will it actually play out?
No, I don't think so, because the ban on extramarital sex and also the ban on people living together without being married cannot be prosecuted unless a close member of the family, a husband or wife, a parent or child of the couple involved, reports the matter to the police. If that doesn't happen, then the police can do nothing, even if it happens in front of them. So if you have an unmarried Australian couple, tourists who go on a trip to Bali, they can't be prosecuted unless their families report them to the Indonesian police, which is pretty unlikely. The circumstance in which it could arise is where an Australian tourist lives with or has sex with an Indonesian person, and that person's family is unhappy and reports it to the police. But if they're not a family member, they can't report it. So we're not going to be able to see religious vigilantes, for example. This is not really about tourists. Where there is concerns is, of course, for gay and lesbian people who can't be married in Indonesia. If they have sexual relations or live together, they are very vulnerable to being reported by members of their family.
And more likely to be as well, you know, and that's a good point, and obviously much more likely to affect actual Indonesian citizens. I guess the interesting one on that window for a tourist, and obviously a lot of Australians flock to Bali, on them falling foul of this is it could happen. If it happens once, you can imagine the headlines and the trips being cancelled.
Well, yes, I think that's right. But I really don't think that this is set up to target foreign tourists. I think it's about politicians positioning themselves as moral champions. And I think it represents a really grave threat to LGBTQI Indonesians. Homosexuality is not illegal in Indonesia, except in the province of Aceh, and it still isn't. But this could allow them to be targeted and imprisoned. So that's a concern. And that sits with some of the other provisions of the law that roll back freedoms, such as a provision that criminalises insulting public officials, and another one that makes it criminal to spread ideas that contradict the state ideology, Pancasila. This is a conservative law that rolls back rights, but it's not targeting tourists.
Okay. Yeah, an indirect way, as you say, of targeting that community, and one that I'm sure concerns many. Tim Lindsey, really appreciate your time today. Thank you.
Oh, that's a pleasure. Thank you.